Hello and welcome to the fifth and last main chapter of my inquiry into the nature and causes of metoo. This is that other channel I don't want my boss to know about. My name is David Bos and I want to remain anonymous. Chapter 5 of whether we're dealing with sexual misconduct or the abuse of power. As you can see quite clearly on my TV, I put the app of abuse in brackets, thus emphasizing that I'm actually not entirely sure whether we're actually dealing with abuse of power or whether this is actually an inherent and raw expression of power that we are witnessing. But first things first. I already touched briefly on the question of power dynamics, which obviously plays a big role in almost all sexual abuse scenarios. Whether it's the casting couch of Mr. Weinstein, the dressing room of Maestro Gatti, or the concert hall in which James David Christie just performed. In almost all of these cases, there is a power dynamic in which the abuser is in charge. So far, I haven't heard of a single case of an employee sexually abusing their boss by unwanted touching and by introducing sexual topics into work floor conversations. Quite understandably so, as most of us would have a hard time imagining the boss smiling awkwardly and wishing silently the employee would stop it. No, that doesn't happen. If an employee does that to a boss and the boss doesn't want it, the boss tells the employee either to stop or the employee is fired. End of story. So if we take all these things into account, we realize that possibly even more than the wide range of accusations of sexual misconduct, the key element that binds all these things together is the power dynamic. If we compare the different accusations that have been raised since the beginning of metoo, then we see anything from "he asked me out for dinner even though I said no last week already" to "he took his private parts out and started pleasuring himself" to "he promised me all sorts of things for sex" to "he inserted sexual topics into the conversation" and so on. As I said in the beginning, I don't think we can treat this all the same, as there are qualitative differences. Also, it does appear as if physical force, like in the classic guy jumps woman from the bushes late at night and rapes her in the forest cases, is rather the exception than the rule in most of the metoo scandals. Most cases of sexual abuse are either enforced psychologically or could be even seen as borderline consensual, as for instance Harvey Weinstein, and with him many others, claims in his defense. Again, that doesn't make this okay behavior. It is despicable nonetheless, but only because some people feel differently about that night, the next morning, the next year, or even 10 years later, when the two movies that they got promised didn't really boost the career the way the victim expected it. Doesn't mean it's clear cut. I can only reiterate that the main question for me is whether that person had actually a choice to participate, or whether the victim was either literally forced physically or psychologically by blackmail. Having a career prospect dangling in front of you and choosing to go down that route might, in my humble opinion, actually be considered consent, even if I'm not a lawyer that could make this call. Here's another thought though, and I admit I'm going into speculative territory here. In physical rape situations, recent studies have shown that the old theory that rapists seek power, not sex, has been disproven or at least put into question. If that is the case, then the main driving force behind classical rape scenarios is sexuality, and the physical force to dominate the victim is just a means of achieving that goal, not the main purpose. Classical rape also differs in the important aspect from all the sexual abuse cases of metoo in that there is no social power dynamic. If there is any power dynamic, it is purely physical. And as I stated before, that element, while present in some cases of metoo, is less typical of most sexual abuse cases. While the rapist in the bushes rarely will be your boss, the one in the dressing room almost always will. But rather than turning this into a clear-cut black and white picture, I again believe that both aspects are in play. Especially for men, power and sexuality are closely connected, and sexuality can often be also about asserting dominance rather than just satisfaction of sexual desires. If that holds true, then sexual abuse is just one possible way of abusing power dynamics in such a situation. Now, I don't claim that I have the answer to which elements are at work to which extent in these situations. That might be something for psychologists to determine, but some basic research makes it rather clear that the psychology on those cases isn't necessarily settled. To me, it seems as if power, sexuality, and dominance all play a certain role, and that the division between those elements is more fluent than anybody wanting to present a stringent theory would care to admit. But when we ask ourselves about the root of the problem, we have to ask the question which of those elements comes first and how they are intertwined. Is power the root from which dominance comes forth, or is natural dominance what leads to power? Does sexuality come forth from any of those two, or can we actually separate it from them? If power always means the assertion of dominance, can we actually call it abuse of power, or is it rather a natural expression of power? Of course, once sexuality comes into play, this equation becomes a whole lot more complicated, but at least the symbiotic relation between power and dominance is quite apparent. But if sexual abuse, as in the case in most of the metoo scandals, is almost always tied to a power dynamic, then maybe sexuality in this relation is nothing else than another expression of dominance, one which admittedly is probably closer to the primal natures of men than those of women. But that would mean in turn that this is more about primal expressions of power and dominance than about sexuality itself. These rich men could easily surround themselves with men or women that feel attracted to their wealth and would do anything for them. And even if they couldn't, they could easily afford the services of prostitutes, escorts, and whatnot. So why bother with people that work for them or their students? Because the power dynamic adds a thrill that is otherwise missing, or at least that's how it comes across to me. In this case, rather than it being about purely sexual arousal, the arousal here comes from the assertion of power and dominance. To put it bluntly, they get hard by dominating others. On top of that, I'm under the strong impression that these rituals, whether it's the sexualized atmosphere in conversations to begin with, or a full-blown abuse, act as a rite of passage, as has also been stated quite clearly by some students of Jim Christie. Despite the wishful thinking that these people in powerful positions lead independent existences where they can choose the right thing to do, they almost never are free from the need to associate themselves with like-minded people that form a circle. Honestly, that is another rather primal and natural reaction of people, as old as humanity itself, to associate with people that are like them, whether it's tribal, religious, racist, nationalist, based on sexuality or political preference. Doesn't matter, but it happens. And as we can see easily in every mafia flick ever made by Scorsese, the rite of passage acts as an insurance that now you're one of us. Now we can trust you, and now you can't turn back. It is no different when we are presented with this choice. Once we make the choice to turn a blind eye in favor of our potential careers, we are knee-deep in it. It is only now, through the MeToo movement, that people that have passed this rite of passage have been given a platform to actually back out of it. The danger is, however, when people quite obviously don't only back out of it, but immediately associate with an anti-circle, which is quite clearly set up in opposition to the old circle, but with the same hierarchical rules in which they attempt to take a leadership position. The rise and fall of Asia Argento is a prime example of this. Mind you, I'm not saying that everybody who tolerated sexual conversations at the organ console is equally guilty of being part of this whole thing, but we had a choice, and as such, we have to face our own conscience about it. The real question for me is, at what point does this expression of power, this natural distinction between we and they, become a problem? What if you work at a company where everybody, down from the boss, shares a certain political attitude and makes it a regular conversational topic, despite it not being a necessity for the daily operations of the company itself? What if someone working at that company disagrees but feels that he has to nod and smile every time something is said about politics, even if he or she doesn't agree in the least? The fear of being singled out as the one person who doesn't think like everybody else is very real, especially nowadays where outrage and disgust is a more common reaction to such a coming out than interest in differing opinions. But we could say, maybe quite rightfully so, that he who runs the company has a right to establish the company culture he wants, and if that includes a certain political bias, then that's his good right to do so. And also, let's be real. Unwanted pressure to participate in certain political talk isn't on the same level as rape. But it might be argued it is comparable to unwanted sexually loaded conversations in a teaching environment. One group might define itself by its sexuality, the other politically, and both share a similar rite of passage in which they infiltrate conversations with loaded topics. If one is problematic, why not the other? Should we regulate political topics on the work floor as well? And while we're at it, religious, cultural and environmental topics as well? Maybe it would be easiest to crack down on all human communication then. That might be the safest solution. Either that, or once again, we man up and create on one hand an atmosphere where it is possible to speak up openly against such monocultures of thought, and where on the other hand, open discussions between opposing opinions are possible. However, I think it is quite a difficult and multi-layered problem to which I don't claim to have the answers, but I do feel that it is important to ask some of the questions I posed as well as many more. Rather than seeing these cases as a result of evil men doing evil things, maybe we'd be better served trying to understand the problem by looking at it on a societal level, meaning that we ask ourselves which parts of our culture should lead to or support such behavior, or to which extent this is an expression of archaic and primal structures that only rear their ugly heads, because we created circumstances as a society that act as a breeding ground for such things. Nowadays, anything that comes across as progress is readily embraced because we want to believe in some utopian vision of a new human. But in doing so, we possibly not only neglect a part of our human nature that hasn't evolved past certain primal structures, but we also forget to stop and ask ourselves whether leaving this part of our humanity behind us would actually be that good of a thing to begin with. Communists and fascists all had dreams of creating a new human, and we all know how bloody these dreams turned out to be. Maybe, instead of trying to regulate every detail of mankind and human interaction into oblivion, we should rather take a look at the moral and intellectual foundations of our society. You oft refer to norms and values, which almost nobody seems to define any further except for insisting that taking a step back behind a perceived achievement is out of the question. For them, a course correction isn't possible. The only way is forward, even if that path means destruction. Maybe we have to rethink this attitude. This is it for my main chapters. Up next is my summary, which isn't necessarily only a repeat of what I said so far, but also adds some thoughts I have on top of it. Plus, if you have skipped some of these bits so far, it's the too long didn't read version. So thanks for watching and see you in a bit.